What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Bjarne Holmes, and we speak about the similarities and differences between educators and facilitators, and what educators can learn from facilitators to enhance the learning experience of students. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, why don't you visit workshops.work to download my free one-page summary. And now, enjoy.
Hey, let's have a really fun time.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's have fun.
Yes, that's what we're here for.
Good.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Let's have fun.
Yes, let's have fun. And let's make sure that the audience also have fun and learn some cool stuff.
If we have fun, I think the audience will have fun.
I agree. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
I think I started calling myself a facilitator. I mean, yes, I do call myself a facilitator. I think I was a facilitator a long time before I actually thought of myself as a facilitator. So the question maybe that I need to answer is, when did I become a facilitator? And that was probably gradual. I think I became a facilitator when I started letting go of my ego.
I like that answer.
And so what I mean by that is this. I always took things very, very seriously. I was always sort of the leader of whatever group I put myself in. I remember being a very bad bass guitarist on a rock punk band called Saddam Hussein. Now, we were horrible, right? But I took it so seriously. And I had to organize, and I had to teach people, and I had to get people to figure it out. And later on, I did a lot of mountaineering and international expeditions and all over the world. I climbed in Himalaya. I did this, and I was often the expedition leader because I often put myself in that situation of wanting to lead and wanting to teach. And I think with age, I figured out that things actually got better if I didn't take myself so seriously. Mm-hmm. Things got better when I let go of my own ego and actually just kind of made myself into trying to build a spider web and just trying to get people to what is facilitation, right? It's sort of, for me, it's removing barriers and building bridges at the same time, if you can, and trying to just allow myself to do that. So I don't know. I think I was a facilitator a long time. I think of what I was in the beginning was a frustrated leader. And then once I figured that out, that I don't actually have to do that. I can just kind of step into the background and I guess lead. I guess it's still leadership, but it's leadership with sort of a soft touch instead of trying to force things.
And do you think, when you think back of your times as a leader mountain climbing, do you think that you would need the same skills as you would apply as a facilitator when helping adults to make sense of things, and or a teacher who helps to educate students?
Facilitation is really about relationships. I mean, that's what it's about. It's about trust. It's about emotions. It is about people's egos, right? It's about being heard, being felt in terms of who you are. It's about people seeing you. It's about people recognizing your worth. And it's about bringing. So I guess bringing could be facilitating different human experiences, different skills, different backgrounds, the diversity of mindsets, if you wish, in education, to the forefront. And I actually like to say, whether it's an international mountaineering expedition going to a part of the world that you've never been in and climbing new mountains, or whether it's a one-time workshop, I like to say it's about coming together and creating what I call microculture. Because what you do there has probably never been done before, and it will probably never be done again. So you have an opportunity. I tell my students sometimes that, they'll email me and they'll say, "What did I miss today?" And I'm not this mean. I don't actually do this. Okay. But I dream about emailing them back and saying, today in class, we figured out the meaning of life and you weren't there. And we now forgot what the meaning of life is. Sorry. No, but I mean, you get my point, right? Like it's a moment. It's a sharp moment. We call it taking the sharp end in climbing. It's a sharp moment of microculture, which is something humans do.
And where everyone or every tiny little aspects actually contribute to it, whether it's the weather condition in a climbing expedition or the dynamics of people sitting in the same room or students coming together to learn together. And then... Yeah.
No, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say.
Wonderful. Instead, I wonder when you're in the role of a leader in charge of making sure that the troop you're guiding through the mountains will survive, or you have a clear goal in mind. So you have an endpoint. And I think the same might be true for education, where you know what kind of knowledge the students shall have acquired at the end of your class. This might be different when working with adults, where basically the participants hold parts of the outcomes or the solution themselves, and only by working together they will bring forth the one solution that applies to this moment in time.
Well, I'm going to have to disagree a little bit. I actually think in mountaineering expeditions and even in teaching, if you get too fixated on the end goal, you actually miss what it's about. It is often about the process. The process is the goal. You don't always know 100% what that is. You might know the things in a climbing expedition, you might know the things that you want to avoid because the barriers between life and death can be sometimes a little thin. So there might be certain things where you don't allow the process to take you there because the consequences are too high. But I think it's process no matter what. I think it's about staying open to what's going to happen. So, I brought up ego before. I think that's actually probably the number one barrier to not facilitating well. It is people's egos. It is people's feeling of needing to be validated. I mean, whether you realize it or not, you've all had a workshop leader or a teacher who had low self-esteem and who was using what they're using as a vehicle to try to feel better. Yeah. And that ruins the human experience. That's going to ruin the expedition. That's going to ruin the teaching moment. That's going to ruin a workshop. That's going to ruin everything. Because what it does, well, definitely every relationship. And what we're really talking about are types of relationships. And it's going to ruin it because it is closing people's minds down to paying attention to what's going on in those relationships and utilizing those to somehow collectively create something amazing.
Yeah, and thank you for disagreeing, because I actually agree with your disagreement. And it's also in teaching, because at the end of the day, it is about the process. And when we ask students or anyone to memorize something, this usually goes wrong. We are so bad in memorizing. But if we get the point, if we have this aha moment of deep understanding, and this usually happens through experience, then we don't need to memorize anymore. And I think that's where the facilitation and education part comes together. How can we create these experiences that might have a life-changing effect?
There is no learning without actual experience.
So how do you create this experience in the classroom? And how did you actually get rid of your ego?
Through frustration. It wasn't, I'm not going to say it was like some aha moment. I didn't take a bunch of psilocybin and sort of have a deep ego experience. I mean, like many of us, I've done a lot of self-work over the years. I don't know if there was an epiphany or a moment or a turning point. I think I just realized with time that I could create what I wanted to create in terms of the relationships and the process, and then moving us towards certain goals. I could do that in a softer way than trying to, and I could do that by just paying attention to what other people were doing and just trying to bring people together. That was the answer to the second part of your question. I forgot the first part of the question.
How you create these experiences, these learning moments for students?
That's a really good question. I tend to say that my classes are about creating knowledge. And so I bring my students together, I invite them together, and I facilitate that creation of knowledge. I mean, does it work sometimes? Yes, not always. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I'm curious about the how.
I think a mistake that I see in some of my colleagues who are new to being educators make, sometimes they overprepare. Mm. They honestly overprepare. They'll walk into a 1-hour class or 1-hour workshop, if you want to think, because listen, we can think of every single class as a workshop. It is.
Absolutely.
It's right.
In the best case, I would say, right. Not every single class is a workship. Has the potential to be one.
Has the potential to be one. Well, not every workshop is a workshop either.
That's true.
But we can think of it as over-preparing can sometimes set you up to not paying attention to who the people are in your class or your workshop, to what their experiences are. And to sort of over-preparing can get you to a point where you're not paying attention to where people want to take it. Now, I'm not saying that it should be an entirely anarchic moment. I'm not saying that, right? It's not a free flow. It is. Facilitation also means that you have a general idea of where you're headed.
Purpose.
But you're not always sure how you're getting there.
Yeah.
And you need to pay attention to what's going on in that moment, because you're going to miss a lot of stuff otherwise.
And I think it perfectly circles back to what you said about the process and about the ego. If you over-prepare, you get married to your content. You prepared it so much, so you wanted to deliver it in the way, and you want them to get it. So you get. Well,
Miriam, why do you think people over-prepare?
I think it's because they're insecure. So
right, exactly.
I remember when the first class that I taught at uni was an absolute disaster because I over-prepared. And I over-prepared because I didn't trust myself that I would know what to tell and how to react to whatever happens in the room. And the same for the podcast. In the very beginning, I had a script with all the questions. And I was so focused on asking the questions that I didn't have the headspace to really listen to the answers.
That's so great. I did exactly the same thing. I produce a podcast as well. And it's so funny. I have exactly the same experience. I used to give people questions. I used to prepare questions. Now I do nothing. But neither one.
Then, as you know, I do prepare questions and I send questions because I think this is where the sweet spot lies. I do prepare questions and I always tell my guests, in most cases, I never ask these questions. But they give us an idea about what we're going to talk about and give us the illusion that we can prepare. And once I wrote them down and shared them, I don't have to look at them again. And I love that. And this is where the sweet spot of preparation is. If we're over-prepared, we get married to our process. If we're under-prepared, we'll end up in chaos. And we cannot take hold, or we cannot guide the group or the conversation towards a shared purpose.
And I love that. And if we can just go back to that teaching moment for a second, and we think of it as creation of knowledge, really, and over-preparing. And what you said was so correct, that people over-prepare because of insecurity, right? And we've probably all been there in life, right? We've all done that. And of course, the more we become quote unquote experts, whatever that means, on something, the more we sort of have to believe fundamentally inside that we have the foundational knowledge that we need to deal with what's going on in the moment, be that the classroom, be that a podcast recording. And I think people going into that classroom as a teacher, over preparing. Okay, let me give you an example. Of course, as a young teacher a long time ago, of course you don't want to acknowledge that there's something you don't know. I mean, a lot of teachers, what keeps them up at night is the idea that a student might ask a question that they don't have an answer for. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, at some point, I don't know when, but at some point I decided, screw that. It doesn't matter. I'm a learner. I'm there to learn from my students just as much. I don't know everything. I just have put more thought into it than them over time. That's all. And we're all there to learn from each other. And if I don't know something now, I acknowledge it. I acknowledge that up front. And I also try very much to acknowledge my biases. But a lot of things are my opinions. And here are my biases. Here are my political biases. Here are my biases in relationships. This and this. I'm not going to be a neutral arbitrator. I'm just a human being. I'm just part of who you are, right? So I think if you can just acknowledge that you are also in a learning moment with your students, and that there are things you're not going to know either, and that's okay, then that's letting go some of that ego.
Yes. And it also brings back the trust that you mentioned. And I think it's not only the trust in ourselves and our own knowledge, but also the trust that something we can work with will emerge in the room. And I think to show this trust in the group, the humility, and still maintaining the authority sounds bad, but hopefully you know what I mean. That this
facilitation,
as a teacher, but also as a facilitator. I think you need to have the authority of the group, which can be a soft one, but they need to trust you that you will guide them through the process.
Agreed.
And to be in the moment, you need to trust yourself and trust the group, and then you can listen. And the humility to also say, okay, maybe I don't know, but either you're going to tell me now and we work it out together, or I will come back to you later.
Agreed. Funny
enough, though, I have the impression that I remember these times very well when I was afraid of students. I suffered from imposter. I still suffer from imposter. I think everyone does. But
I was just going to say, as does almost everyone, right? So
yeah,
yeah.
I think even without exception. But I was afraid of students, and I had more confidence talking to peers at the same level than to students, which is maybe this is a key difference between a facilitator and educator.
What do you mean?
That as a facilitator, you're more perceived at least on the same level, whereas an educator, you're always, as a default, put on the pedestal, so that you have to...
I see what you mean. Mm-hmm. So, and there's always pressure from that too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to some degree, it's important. I mean, one thing that we do within the academy or academia generally, or anybody that sort of gains so-called expert knowledge within, I'm doing air quotes for your audience, so you know that, is we create jargon. Mm. We create terminology that is jargon. And I'm aware of that. So sometimes I'm aware of the fact that there are complex ideas that I am overeducated for to explain to a person who hasn't heard it before. I have not done enough work to figure out how to explain a complex, and don't ask me for an example because I can't think of one, but I have not done enough work in the moment, right? I have not done enough preparation, maybe because the idea to explain this concept popped into my mind because of where something that one of the learners in my class said. And I'll see it. I'll look out in my class. I'll look around in my class because I'm often active and I'm walking around and whatever. I'll look around and I can see sort of the blank stare. And I'm like, uh-oh, this is not connecting.
Yeah.
But I maybe know that, you know what? There are going to be some learners here who get what I'm saying. And maybe they probably also done some preparation reading for this. And so they're going to get it. At that moment, the best thing that I like to do is turn it over to peer-to-peer learning. Mm-hmm. So I'll ask people who sit beside each other, maybe in groups of 2 or 3, instead to talk about the concept and explain it to each other in their own words. Now, do they get it? Or is it going to be exactly the way I would have tried to get it? No, of course not. But it's going to be pretty good. So there are moments when actually I'm overeducated in terms of taking higher level jargon that I've created. And the truth is, I'll tell my students this all the time, like, how would you explain that to a 10-year-old?
I think this example is magic, because also when the students turn to each other to try to explain the concept, they will realize what they haven't understood yet. So they can come back and ask the questions so that they will understand. This will then again help you to boil it down. Recalibrate, right. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we underestimate this tool or this way of working, even when working in workshops with adults, that there's this moment of aha when we try to formulate our own thoughts and to explain to someone else, what did we get out of the last 15 minutes? Or how do we explain it? How do we make sense out of it in our own words? And this is where the real learning happens.
Okay. You heard me say before that learning only happens through experience.
Mm-hmm.
As an educator, and I guess I can see myself as a facilitator nowadays. All right. I can buy that. As an educator, I would say that the most powerful education tool is to teach. And I would say that you only learn through experience, but you really, really learn something when you have to teach it to somebody else. And I think anybody that has been an educator knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's one thing to sit, if you're a third grade math teacher, it's one thing to sit down and understand something. It's another thing to teach it to somebody else.
Oh, yeah.
And I think using that as a teaching tool is powerful, whether it's a classroom or whether it's a workshop, because, and it's actually something I try to do. I try to flag post a lot in my class. And what I mean by that is I try to get students to identify goals that they have themselves for what they want to learn, but also goals for what it is that they're going to identify that they want to teach. And almost every single class, asking students to write down something that they learned that day or that past week that they intend to teach somebody else in the coming days to week. And, and that's just it. It's like, honestly, if I could build my own educational system, we would all be learners and then we would all be teachers.
I love the concept. And it makes me think of one of my PhD advisors. He always said that he only teaches the same course 3 times because afterwards he doesn't learn anything anymore.
That's actually quite beautiful. And I'm going to learn from that.
You. And I would like to come back to something you mentioned in the classroom where you look into the students' eyes and you see this glaze that they zoned out.
Mm-hmm.
Whose responsibility is it, especially when we talk of higher education? So where students basically sit in the classroom because they decided to. Is it the responsibility of the educator / facilitator to engage and entertain them? Or is it their responsibility? And at some point as an educator, you say, you know what? If you zone out and prefer to check your emails, then it's your thing.
It's both, to be honest. I believe, I was one of those educators that a few years ago, I was teaching in the Scottish education system, and students were took a little more responsibility for themselves than some students in the US education system. So I didn't really have to tell the students in the Scottish system to put their phones away. And so when I came back to the US and I started teaching there, people would do things with their phones. And I was I'm dealing with adults here. I shouldn't have to tell people to put their phones away. But I realized, nope, that doesn't work. So I did, I sort of ask everybody to, listen, human beings are going to do what human beings are going to do, right? So one of the things you can do as a facilitator is set the environment up, right? Set the setting in such a way that it's going to work. So if you intentionally pick a horrible setting, right? If you intentionally pick a classroom that has a construction noise right beside it, of course, there's going to be a distraction. And I want to say, if you allow certain things to occur, which is access to phones, access to technology that isn't necessary, of course, you are automatically shooting yourself in the foot, right? And that's where you used the word authority before. I guess that's where you have that authority, right? You have the authority to control the space, to demand certain things. I usually tell my students, like, we're going to get in the circle today. All you need is yourself, your mind, the knowledge of the readings you've done the past week, the preparation that you've done. And unless you absolutely, if you absolutely need an exception, fine, speak to me. But otherwise, put your devices away, turn your phones off. I take mine off. We all turn it off together. And let's just be here together. Let's be here in this moment. Now, I had one student one time come up to me between class and say, listen, I want to keep my phone on because I have children in school and something could happen. And I thought about it. And I thought, how can I be a polite, kind, smart ass? And maybe she can get she can get what I'm saying at the same time. I said, look, you know what? The class is only for 2 hours. And we take breaks. We take breaks about every 20 minutes. So at that time, turn your phone on and check to see if there's any messages. And I said, you know what? If something does happen to your child, at least you'll delay knowing it and you'll be happy for another hour before your world falls apart. Luckily, I had a good relationship with this person already. She understood my humor. She got my point, and we all laughed about it a lot.
Love that. And I think that's really where relationship comes in.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wouldn't do that with somebody I didn't already know.
And it makes total sense, especially in situations where we cannot change the truth. But this might be a different conversation.
But hang on a second. You asked circle back to your question, because you asked whose responsibility is it. So I do think it is a facilitator's responsibility to some degree. I mean, we've all been at big conferences where we wanted to give a talk or do something, and we ended up with the most horrible space, right? I remember once I was in, this was a lot of years ago, but I was doing a talk at the International Association for Relationship Research, and it was on Crete. And I remember that we had to change venue, and I ended up giving a talk outside, right beside the pool, with a lot of tourists actually, sort of jumping in and out of the pool. And at first, of course, I was a graduate student at the time. Like, you get really nervous about these things. But the truth is, I mean, we had a blast. And if anything, I think various strange audience members joined in. I mean, you're on vacation, you're listening to somebody talk about relationships. Suddenly, that's kind of interesting. So we've all been in those situations. We can't control those environments. We've all been given a space we don't know. I think it's important to try to visit a space first, so you know what a space feels like, so you can work with it. Or in some situations, try to make the best of it, literally. Like, what can I do to make this work, right? So that's on us, right? It's on us to also signpost, to sort of set the environment for what it is we want to happen. Yep. But at some point, we don't own everything. It is a contract, whether it's a workshop or whether it's a class that goes across a semester. If you're doing the very best you can from your side of it, and you have a student who is choosing not to do their side of it, at some point, of course, it's on them, and you shouldn't own that.
Yeah. And I think there's also where the design comes in. So you can, as you mentioned before, you invited the students to sit in a circle. This sets the design for a certain way of conversation. And you mentioned that you're taking breaks every 20 minutes.
We can't concentrate more than 20 minutes as humans. There's a lot of research on that. It doesn't have to be long breaks. It can literally be, 3 minutes. And the other thing I try to tell students all this all the time is like, I get up and walk a lot. I don't sit down. Students sit down often. What happens when they sit down? Well, you get tired. I tell my students, you don't have to sit down. Get up and walk around, do yoga in the back of a room, lay down if you want to lay down, do exercise. It doesn't matter as long as you are participating on whatever is going to help you participate actively. Do it.
Yeah. This is so mindful of where the students are. And I think it just shows how our education system comes from a past that has nothing to do anymore with where we are today when we talk about collaboration in the classroom instead of just one person teaching for 1.5 hours and expecting everyone to listen and sit down and take notes and to memorize instead of...
Here's a moment where I'm going to disagree again. I don't think our education system, I think that's a stereotype of our education system, but I actually don't think that that's been true. I think I would say the same thing if I didn't think about it a little bit more, because what you're really talking about is a certain type of very narrow education system historically that an elite got, right? I mean, maybe 1% of our society, if you're talking about 500 years ago. But education isn't like that. Everything we do in life is education, right? Like when an elder in a community in Southeast Asia 1,000 years ago sits down with a group of children and tells them a story that is intended to capture their attention at a certain age. Is that not a workshop? Is that not education? Of course it's education. Yeah. And I don't think that we had these proper rules. It was more, you understand what I'm saying? Like maybe it was sitting in a circle, but it probably was also experience and it was moving around. So I don't think, the good news in that is I don't think that's the model we see as the sort of education that of a certain type of elite that has been born out and that we see in some now old-fashioned types of university systems. That is actually not how education works for 99.9% of humans throughout our history, or other mammals, or other animals for that matter.
Makes sense.
So that's the good news. The bad news is some of us got stuck in systems, right? Where we shouldn't have to have a John Dewey telling us that experiential education is important, because it should be self-evident. In fact, I don't even think you shouldn't even be able to talk about education without thinking of experience, right?
And I wonder whether any educator would actually disagree. I think it takes more preparation in a different way, less ego, more trust, and more flexibility. And I think it's easier on the short side to just deliver a lecture where students sit down and listen for 1.5 hours than to really create the space where learning can be experiential.
Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe it is easier. I don't know if it's easier. I mean, I've done that too. It takes a lot of preparation. I've taught classes where it's 100 to 200 people. Though, the thing is, you don't have to do a large lecture if it's boring. I've been in lectures where in Scotland, I taught 200 students. I mean, we also took breaks. I gave breaks there every 20 minutes. So what? You're in a theater style mode. I had 3 large screens. I mean, it does become a lot more about entertainment. But I had one person that was always a volunteer running around with a microphone up in the audience. I was always asking students to speak up. And you can ask students to talk to each other even if you're lecturing with 200 people, because you don't have to talk for more than like 3 or 4 minutes yourself. You can show a video clip and then you can ask students to discuss it. And guess what? They're still sitting beside each other. So you can say, turn to each other and talk about this and come up with a solution. What you can't do, which is a lot harder, is read the room, right? Like that is more about preparation, because you need to you can't, like if you're teaching a group of 20 people, I'd say the group might take you on a trajectory that curves a little bit more than what a larger audience does. So it is a little different. And I'd say the same, sorry to interrupt you, but I'd say the same thing if you're giving a talk at a keynote address. I mean, what better way to have fun at a keynote address than to involve the audience, right? I mean, you do have to control it. I mean, you have to tell people in advance, and I tell my students this sometimes, that if you get up and you start babbling, then I'm going to interrupt you and shut you down, because there's a no babbling rule. No, like talking about, so you have to do the same thing. You have to dare to do the same thing if you involve an audience. Is you have to just say, listen, there's going to be a limit, right? But I think as long as you let people know in advance that that's what you intend to do, you won't harm their egos as much, unless, of course, they're a famous old professor who wants to just talk.
Yes. and I think telling them in advance, then the entire group will be thankful. And yes, you might piss off one individual, but if the West is actually thankful and gets positive energy out of that, maybe it's worth the cost.
I'll give you and I agree, but I'll give you a reason why you don't want to just do the traditional lecture stuff. If you can, the reason why is because it's boring.
Yes, for everyone.
And I was just going to say, it's boring for the audience, but it's boring for you. You are slowly committing soul death.
And you know what? I think it is boring for the audience because it is boring for you. Because I remember this math lecturer. I mean, the content was just math. So nothing exciting about that. But he was so excited about his content and what he's about to teach and to show us all the proofs for an equation that it just sparked over. So I think whatever it takes, the educator, and I think for the facilitator, it's the same. We do spark energy, and it can be positive, energizing energy, and it can be quite destructive energy if we become judgmental and try to push and pull participants or students around.
I think energy is a really good word. It's a really good way to put it. And from our pre-interview that my expertise is in relationships, and it is about relationships. And it is about a give and take when it comes to energy. That's a good way to think of it. Energy within air quotes again.
Hi, this is Andrew. I'm a facilitator and head of customer success at Session Lab, the dynamic workshop planner tool. More than 30,000 facilitators, trainers, and coaches use our workshop planner tool and save time and effort in the design process. So, how do they do it? Our drag-and-drop agenda builder makes it easy to transform your ideas into high-quality workshops, and the timing of your agenda automatically updates when you make changes. You can collaborate in real time with your colleagues and easily share professional-looking printouts with your clients. And if you need inspiration, you can check out our library of more than 500 activities and exercises and simply drag the ones you need right into your workshop agenda. So check out Session Lab to save time and effort in your workshop design process. And now get your first 2 months of Session Lab Pro absolutely free at sessionlab.com/workshopswork.
So what have you learned from your background in relationship and your research on relationships about how to become a better facilitator and educator?
Well, I would say that you really have to pay attention, even if it's a large group or it's a small group. You have to pay attention to what the connections are between people. And you have to pay attention to who people are and how they're relating to one another. We have this, we think of sometimes, to go back to an old sociological concept of collective consciousness, we also have what we call group intelligence, right? Mm-hmm. And the classic example I like to do in an intro to psychology class is I'll actually literally bring in a jar of candies, and I'll like a huge jar with several hundred pieces of candy, and I'll ask each student to guess how many candies are in the jar, right? And then we see that the average across students is always closer to the actual number than anybody's guess, right? So that's, people are always awed by that, but it's not really that strange when we think about sort of a group intelligence. But what I want to say is if you're paying attention to the relationships between people, you also are paying attention to who they are. And if you're paying attention to who they are, then you have an opportunity to use the diversity in mindsets of the people who are part of your group to better create knowledge. And what I mean by that is if you want to find an interesting solution, I mean, okay, if your workshop is all about you conveying and spewing knowledge in one direction, forget all of this. Ignore what I'm about to say.
I wouldn't call it a workshop.
Okay, good. Me neither. But if your workshop is about coming out with something new, where everybody walks away from that experience feeling that they felt validated, or they felt seen and heard as a human being, and that's the relationship part, and where they feel inspired to take action on something, whatever it is, and where they feel that they have something they want to go and teach other people, right? Mm-hmm. That's where you know you've succeeded. If somebody's excited about teaching somebody else, you know you've succeeded, right? But if that is about creating new knowledge, then one thing we do know from sort of group intelligence is that you can amplify the intelligence intentionally by the mixtures of people you put together to work on finding a solution. So, for instance, if you have people with diverse mindsets and they're going to try to find a solution to a problem, the diversity in those mindsets, the different approaches, the expert knowledge, the experiences they have, is more likely to find us a new solution, right? So, I mean, it doesn't work if you go too far outside, right? So if you're working on building a new type of airplane wing, right? And you bring in somebody who is a dog trainer, that might not work. But if you bring in an artist who might look at aerodynamics differently, they're not an engineer, but you put them together with an engineer and you put somebody else together with that, and suddenly you will actually have the potentiality. It's not a given, but you have the potentiality for elevated form of group intelligence. And so the relationships matter because it is up to you as a facilitator over time, if you are working with people over time, to sort of be able to see those and sometimes intentionally group people together.
What makes a workshop fail for you?
Yeah, it's people make workshops fail. So it's about go back to where we started to some degree. It's about people's egos. And of course, setting. I mean, the setting can really make a workshop fail. You don't have control over that, right?
Which brings us to, it's a beautiful bridge to another topic that I wanted to explore. We don't control the setting if we're in the same physical room. We can control the setting more if we're all online. And I would like to link that to what you said earlier about the students zoning out and how you engage them. Do you think that it's easier to facilitate experiential learning in an online environment than in an offline environment, or more difficult?
I don't know if I can answer whether it's easier or not easier. It's different. But let's put some context on this. We're in the middle of a pandemic. About a year ago, as an educator, as a university educator, we suddenly were thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of other people all around the world, whether it be work or education, recognize the situation because we've all experienced it at the same time. Many of us, we were forced to go online. And some of us, myself included, had probably already put some thought into that, but other people were really caught off guard at all in having to do that. Some of us felt sort of comfortable with technology to some degree. But the truth is, at that time, no, I could not do that. I could not continue to do very well what I wanted to do because the generalist webinar tools like Zoom and Google Meets that we all kind of just had there as tools, suddenly, they did not allow that facilitation. I mean, listen, like I said, I'm the kind of professor who puts students in a circle, right? I'm the kind of professor that says, hey, show up. We're going to engage. We're going to stay very engaged with each other. And I mean, I did the same thing. I used Zoom in the beginning, and that it just didn't work. I mean, that's the truth. It just didn't work. Like the asynchronous teaching. So asynchronous meaning that your students do work online, but not at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. So they might do discussions, they might do assignments, that's worked really well in the past 10 years. I mean, some people have adopted a lot more than others. But I'm one of the people that adopted a lot, right? Like I haven't used paper probably within a class or books or a photocopier in probably a decade, right? So everything I do is through one of the educational platforms that we have. And those have been really well. And they actually, in the last decade, are what facilitated online education in an asynchronous format, meaning not face-to-face meetings. But I would actually argue that one of the reasons why online education in that asynchronous format, despite all the hours and all the money that's been poured into making that kind of online education great in many ways from a pedagogical standpoint, despite that, it hasn't really caught on it never really caught on to the degree that one would expect it would, right? Because yeah, it's convenient, right? You can do education from a distance. And I would say what was missing was the human experience, the relationships, right? So that's interesting because here we have a pandemic that's then forcing us to suddenly do the online education, but forcing us also, mandating us to have synchronous teaching, to have face-to-face teaching, right? But those generalist tools like Zoom and Meets, I think in those synchronous moments of face-to-face, they fall flat because they're not built for it. They're not built for that tool. In fact, they kind of make us a little lazy. I'll be honest with you. I know it sounds extreme, but there are cases where students are, like you'll click in and they are literally, their camera is off. You're not sure where they are. And for all you know, they're walking their dog or they're driving or they're in the grocery store. And I'm sorry, maybe if you're the kind of educator who just likes to lecture, but even then, I'm not so sure your student's going to be listening if they're at the grocery store. But for me, again, I require attention. I demand attention of my students, and I expect them to show up and create knowledge. So we needed something different.
So what did you do? Tell us, the Holy Grail.
Well, I didn't really do so much of anything. At my college, Champlain College in Burlington, Vermont, a very awesome human being there, Noreen Hall, a friend, Dr. Noreen Hall. She's a data scientist. She got really frustrated. And it's interesting because out of frustration, sometimes something is born. And together with her childhood friend, Heikenish, they decided, hey, if we can't figure out a way, if this is what we're going to be stuck with, why don't we build something? Why don't we build a platform that we can teach on? We can do better than this. So out of that, they started coding, and this was last summer, right? God, time is all like sort of floating together here. This was last summer, and they created something called InSpace. It's now a company, InSpace Proximity. It's in over 150 colleges and universities globally, and growing like crazy. But basically, I can now do, and they launched the product in October, and I originally got involved, frankly, because I looked at this tool and I said, oh, hell yes. This is an opportunity to do something. I can do something here. I can actually teach differently here. And you're eager to ask a question, so go ahead, please.
No, I was just wondering whether I want to bring the audience in to give them a visual imagination of what you're talking about, or maybe you're sharing this in a moment, of what is the key difference between a Zoom or Google Meets call and InSpace. So what makes it so special?
I'm going to get there. I promise.
Good.
I will get there. And when I thought you said the audience, I thought you meant the goats here in the background. I don't know if you can hear the goats, but
they might be curious as well.
They could be. There you go. You hear them, right?
Complaining. Tell us more. Tell us more. Tell us more.
So let me just stay with the story for a second, and then I'm going to actually build. We'll build a sort of an image for your audience, I will, though they kind of have to see it to believe it. It's kind of hard to believe until you really see it. But the point is, I got involved because as a psychologist, I really care, and as an educator, I really care about the human experience. And I'm sure that marine and hikers sometimes probably think I'm a pure pain in the butt, because again, what did we talk about before? We talked a little bit about how if you can put different types of people that come at something, the same problem, but they have different diverse mindsets, right? So I'm an educator, Marine's an educator, other people involved, everybody in our team is either an engineer and educator, but as a psychologist, you don't usually work in a tech company. It's different. But I mean, that said, I hope they put up with me sometimes, but I can now so we launched in October. I've been teaching everything within InSpace this semester, and I did last semester too, but I can now pretty much do anything that I could do in the non-virtual, for lack of a better word, non-virtual classroom. So the traditional classroom, I can pretty much do anything in terms of creating a pedagogical experience for my students within InSpace that I could do before. And so what that means is I can still sit my students in a circle. I can lecture to them. I can call them up on the stage. We can all sit around a movie, a film clip, and watch that together with it surrounding us in theater seating. I can put people in breakout rooms that are similar to me asking students to sit at different tables. But unlike Zoom or Meets, where you all get sent off into the void and you're not sure where people are, in InSpace, people can remain aware of the fact that they're still in the same room or in the same space, and they can still see the other students. So there's still this social human connection and contact. And the most important thing, really, is that we gave agency and control back. So the first thing when you get into InSpace, you notice, besides the beautiful backgrounds, because you can control your backgrounds, you can set your backgrounds up as a science teacher a certain way, or as I was teaching a class a few weeks ago I wanted to make a point to some of my students about certain genetic polymorphism on the DRD4 dopamine receptor. And I wanted to show if you have a certain allele on that particular dopamine receptor, a certain polymorphism, then there's some research that indicates that you as an infant are less likely to be sensitive to how good a parent your parent happens to be or not. So what did I do? Well, I went into Photoshop, of course, and I found where that exists on the human genome, and then we all sat around that in the background and we discussed it. And it kind of made it more real, right? So besides the fact that you notice immediately how beautiful the backgrounds are, the first thing that people notice is that they're free. They are not locked up in a box anymore. Their avatars can move. You can move around, and you have agency and control again. Now, if you're a lazy educator or a lazy student, you probably liked being locked into boxes. Probably you're also the type of educator then that gets up and just does the bare minimum in an actual classroom, frankly. So while in the future, maybe the company will get to the point where some tools are being built to help educators become better educators. I mean, I can see a lot of possibilities there, right? I don't know. But one thing I'll say is that the preparation that you have to do for any type of workshop, facilitation, meeting, by the way,
yes,
or a class, and the preparation that you have to do for a physical sort of flesh to flesh, for lack of a better word, because meeting, you have to do the same. You have to do the same thing within InSpace, in a sense. But the thing, what's different than the generalist web tools that we had before, is that you now have that potential. You can now design a class the same way. You can now think about, do I want to open them a certain way? Do I want to put them in a presentation room? Do I want to call people up to the stage? Do I want to put people in a circle? How much do I want, am I using flipped classroom techniques? So how much do I want to have them doing this kind of work? Do I ask them to turn off the camera and their microphones and go and work for 20 minutes and then come back and sit in circles and groups and within each and every breakout space, they can work collaboratively on documents. I had the tools to do that now. It's only going to be as good, just like it would be in real life. It's only going to be as good as my thoughtfulness as a facilitator.
Absolutely.
But it's a game changer. It's a game changer. It really is.
And I like the way you put it, that it gives back agency, because I think nobody wants to be a lazy teacher, facilitator, even a student. If I, as a student, decide to dial into a lecture and then decide to turn my video off, to turn my audio off, and to spend 1.5 hours on Facebook, are they happy with this choice? No, because they dialed in the first place, right? So if they would get a chance to actually experience learning, to experience a classroom where they leave and want to teach someone else about what they've just learned, I think everyone would be better off. But then I think we become lazy, and this might still circle back to the initial question of ego and control. It's insecurity. So on Zoom, I know how it functions. The lecturer is already stressed enough with this new technology. So being in a new environment, admitting that he or she might know even less about this tool than the students, because it's technology, so the younger generation with a higher probability knows more, that causes extra stress. And they are thrown back to their early days of, I have to admit that I don't know everything. But I think it's a nice opportunity, for educators.
Well, you said before that you had you said your PhD advice or a PhD advisor or something that had said if you don't teach a class more than 3 times, right? As a professor, as an educator, you have to want to learn new things, right? You have to want to learn new things. And InSpace is actually pretty intuitive. It's actually pretty easy to learn. Listen, we asked hundreds of students about what they said about InSpace. And the thing that they said the most is that nothing else they've used since the pandemic started, nothing else they've used reminds them as much of actually being in the classroom.
Which hopefully is a good thing.
I think so. I think it's I think so. I think what they're talking about is that InSpace has brought this sort of social cues back. And what I mean by that is, and it relates back to the relationships again, that you actually have to kind of be mindful of each other. You have to notice each other. You have to pay attention. I do a little fun exercise in the beginning. Like I said, in the classroom, in the physical classroom, I'll intentionally, like I said, put people in a circle in the beginning, right? So maybe we're 20 students in a circle. So there's always a student or 2 or 3 that come in late. And I'm aware of that. And guess what? If I formed a perfect circle, when that student comes in, it's not a perfect circle anymore. We have to recircle. We have to re-establish a circle. I do exactly the same thing in InSpace now. We form a circle at the beginning of class, and then a student pops in, and we have to but guess what? It's those little things that keep people on their toes.
Yes.
As long as nobody feels embarrassed from it, but they don't.
Yeah. And it makes everyone heard and seen, which is essential. And the other thing that just crossed my mind with the beauty of InSpace, what you said, as opposed to the breakout rooms on Zoom, is as the teacher, you can walk towards the group and check in with them without sneaking in, without appearing suddenly, but they can literally see you coming, which is a very gentle way of joining a conversation or joining a group.
Yeah, I can put people in breakout rooms. So that's like the sort of equivalent of asking people to go to different tables. And like I said, within those breakout rooms, I can have 10 of them open at the same time. They can have 10 videos going on or 10 like Google Docs that they're working on simultaneously, whatever. I can hover as this authoritarian professor god, if I want to, in the main space, way above. A student knows where I am, maybe just like it would be in the classroom, a physical classroom. They might leave their breakout room quickly and walk up to me and ask a question, a clarifying question. And guess what? only that student and I can hear each other's conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I might choose to follow them back down to that group, and I might choose to then answer that question. Maybe I realized that there was something that was unclear, so I'll push broadcast mode and broadcast to all my students simultaneously in the space and say, hey, by the way, this person asked this, so I need to clarify a certain thing. One of the brilliances of InSpace is proximity audio. So what that really means, proximity audio, and there's a lot of machine learning that goes into these systems, by the way. But one of the brilliances of proximity audio is that in the general spaces that you move around, the closer you are to people, the more likely they can hear you. And when you move away to a certain distance, they can't hear you as well. So that brings back the opportunity for sort of networking, or in a classroom, you can sort of form like sort of clusters of people, and you can move around between them, and they have the ability to move around too. So again, what's different about this is that suddenly the synchronous components of teaching, meaning face-to-face, is very possible remotely.
Yeah.
And why is that important? Well, for a lot of reasons. It opens up a totally new way of thinking about education, because suddenly the barrier to an exciting online education that also includes the human element, that includes the relationships, suddenly that's possible. Suddenly we can do good asynchronous education combined with good remote, distanced, synchronous education, because we suddenly have a tool. And I believe that's the future we're headed towards. I think that's where we're going.
Awesome. And this would have been my final question that you just answered.
I mean, and here's the other thing. At this point, InSpace has been very much in the mode of trying to say, how do we create a tool that's built, for educators or by educators for educators, that, by the way, works for workshops as well, works for conferences as well, works for work meetings as well, because it has the same elements of the tools that you need. But we just happen to be educators that started it, or Noreen did. And if you think about it this way, at this point, it's all been about how do we replicate the non-virtual environment? How do we make that possible? I think we've already solved that.
And I wouldn't say replicate, enhance.
And
we don't want to.
Okay, good. I'm glad you said enhance, because that's where I was just going. Because here's the interesting thing. For some of us that are at the tip of the curve or at the tip of the spear or whatever, thinking about this kind of stuff and excited about it, right? About the potentiality of a student who can't traditionally join a class because they're not able to. The student who sits, the brilliant student who maybe sits somewhere in the world and wants to have access to a class but cannot afford the potential of traveling to that other country to take that class with a relatively low bandwidth internet connection, lower than Zoom, I'll tell you that. They can connect and they can participate, right? That potentiality is amazing, right? And the potentiality then of what if we can make the experience even better? And so what do I mean by that? I don't know. I don't know where this is going. I'm not even sure we know, right? It's a process as we develop. But there's so much potential for artificial intelligence to be involved. I'll give you an example. We have our chat room, or our chat tool, has artificial intelligence in it, that if you type in hate speech, hate language, the system detects that and asks you, do you really want to say that? Or it won't post it. That's an example of using machine learning and artificial intelligence really interestingly. What if we have AI bots that are embedded into our classrooms virtually that also help us? And what if they help the students? And what if they help, more importantly, what if they help the educators by giving us background information and knowledge of what's going on in the classroom and allowing us to pivot as in a way that we couldn't otherwise do, right? What happens when we're obviously working in two-dimensional spaces. What happens when we are able to use augmented realities and virtual realities? I mean, the potentialities are limitless. And then you were going to ask something.
No, it's just, I was reflecting that there's a difference between asking the student, are you sure you want to post that? Or to flag it to the educator, oh, there's something going on that you might want to pay attention to, than to purely censor it. Because I think censorship is it's a thin line. And then we always depend on someone who writes the algorithm in the background, right? So we are not at the stage where artificial intelligence is really intelligent. It still needs the human intelligence. So,
well, I'm not the data scientist, so I don't know if I can even speak to that. But I think there's more intelligence. Well, it's a question of how we define intelligence, but I think it's more advanced than I think a lot of people realize. And I do think there are some forms of hate speech that simply should get flagged. And that's usually what gets flagged. I mean, that's what gets censored, right? Yeah. But the other thing that I think should be brought up here, because I think it's super interesting, we are going to move into a post-pandemic world, somewhat. I think things will be different. But I think what's coming next and coming fast, and I think that InSpace, we are creating the solution for this right now, is going to be the hybrid learning environment. So what you're going to see next is the classroom that has students within it, probably still socially distanced to some degree, probably still masked to some degree with vaccines. And maybe you have 12 students in a classroom, 15 students in a classroom, and you have 5 or 6 students that are remote still because they have flexibility and they want to be able to do that. And what InSpace is doing is building right now that system to be a seamless, beautiful experience for both the educators and the students.
And I cannot wait to invite you and Irene back on the show to hear then what the solution looks like, because I'm intrigued. And I do have doubts how it can work to have some students in the same physical space while some are remote. Because I think we always have the preference to turn to our neighbor, as you mentioned earlier.
I'm happy you have the doubts, and I'm happy that we're going to convince you.
Wonderful. I cannot wait.
Excellent.
Wow. I cannot believe that we have talked for over an hour. And time passes by if you have interesting topics to discuss, right? But maybe someone fell asleep after minute 2, just woke up, and doesn't have time to listen to the entire episode. What would you like them to walk away with?
What would you like for them to walk away with?
This is my standard question. And usually I would yes and you. I will. Okay. If I had that so intentionally. If I had to summarize our conversation, then it's that educators and facilitators both carry the responsibility to transform the process into an experience, because that's how they can engage the audience, whether they're students or adults. And that the future of education is that there are chances that the future of education might be hybrid and engaging and even enhanced than the traditional classroom.
Miriam, that was so much more sophisticated than what I would have done. So my turn. If that happened, if you just woke up and you just heard the end of it, don't be lazy. Rewind, back up, slow down your life, go for a walk, go for a run, and listen to the whole damn thing. Come on.
It.
That would have been my answer.
Or download my 1-page free summary on the website, workshops.org.
There you go. And I would say, check out InSpace.
Absolutely.
Check it out.
I put all the links in the show notes, and I'm looking forward to the demo and the follow up on hybrid.
Well, thank you. And thank you for being such an excellent facilitator. You made me feel very, very welcome.
Wonderful. That's my job.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. Have a continued amazing day.
Thank you. Same to you. Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention, as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, Please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.